end of this talk, you will understand why I labeled it for the meantime like this. And before I forget, the project is funded by the Excite Training Network. It's a Marie Curie fellowship. So let me start with you telling a story how I got hooked on this idea. So I had to attend an event in a remote place recently, and there was no way for me to take public transport, and I'm also not owning a car. So I thought, okay, what can I do? And I was remembering that as a freshman in college, I used ride-sharing platforms. And this was pretty much the only way for me to get to this remote place. And for those of you who have not been across ride-sharing platforms, it's a customer-to-customer platform where somebody who is driving, let's say from London to Liverpool, is able to post this ride if he still has some spots left in his car or her car. And then other passengers can see the posted rides and may join in and pay the driver directly. This is how I remembered the business concept. So there was no charge for passengers and also no charge for drivers. But then when I turned to the platform again, I saw I was facing this choice, and this is in German, but I hope you will still understand the relevant information. So I could either choose a 1-week subscription for 150, and a subscription means in this context that I would have the chance for 1 week to see all the rides which are posted on this platform for 1 week. And then I still would have to pay the driver once I used this ride. But the 150 was just to be connected to the driver in a way. Or I could also choose a longer subscription for 6 months, which was 49 cents more expensive. And regarding my recent frequency of usage of those platforms, I knew that I would have been much better off with the short subscription. Still, I chose the long subscription. And to me, as I'm also a behavioral researcher, as you too, I wanted to understand why did I commit this irrational behavior. And thinking about this, I came across a theory by Thaler, who describes the economic transaction along 2 dimensions. So one is what he's calling the acquisition utility. This is reflecting the rational consideration of a transaction. And I'm convinced if the short subscription was instead presented as a single day or single use subscription, I probably would have picked this instead of the long subscription. Why? Because I feel a single use making it very salient that I'm only here for this one time. And it also reminds me that I'm probably not going to use it again anymore, considering my past behavior. And then I would be happy to save on the 50 cents, although it's not much. But once the short subscription was presented as a week, essentially as a time interval, and therefore in the same category as the long subscription, I started to also look at this from a different perspective. I thought about regret, and also because they are comparable now, I thought about marginal value. And clearly the 6-month subscription yields a better marginal value than the short subscription. And this is why I call this the pigeonholing effect, because now I'm categorizing the 2 options along the same class in a way. And this is what Thaler, okay, now I can come back to my initial point about Thaler. This idea of a non-rational evaluation of a good is what he's calling transaction utility. So even if you are facing a deal which gives you positive value, so the utility or the value of this good is exceeding the price asked, you may still reject the deal if you feel the deal is unfair. For example, if you just learned that the seller bought the good himself for a ridiculously cheap price maybe 10 minutes ago, then you would be still not feeling comfortable to accept the deal. And this is irrational in a way. And this kind of reminded me what was maybe going on, because I would have picked the single use, but not the 1 week. So it seemed to be there was some violation of the dominance principle, because I assume that everybody would agree that the 1 week is definitely preferable over a single use subscription. But once they were contrasted against the longer subscription of 6 months, then my preferences switched. So I had the feeling that this was some kind of subscription trap. And also the fact that this was the only evidence I was still able to retrieve after a couple of months. This picture here also kind of confirms that this is maybe a too obvious subscription trap. But I still wanted to see if other people feel the same way or also would behave the same way. So I ran a pilot at the University of Venice, and I asked roughly 100 students, imagine you want to book a shared ride on BlaBlaCar, and before you can go ahead and pay the ride to the driver, you have to choose between 2 alternative platform fees. One is 1 week of unlimited platform use for €3, or 10 weeks for $4.99. And there, a vast majority, they preferred the longer subscription. But once I replaced the 1 week subscription, the shorter one, by a single use, so practically reducing the value of the short subscription, I found this. So more people seem to be attracted by the short subscription. Kind of what I was expecting. I also have some other data which shows a different direction. For example, when I post the same question on a different group of subjects, only increasing the price of the longer subscription, increasing from 5 to almost €80, then naturally less people seem to prefer the longer subscription because it becomes more expensive. I think this is rational. But then once I replaced the 1 week subscription by a single platform use, also less people preferred the short subscription. So it seems to be quite price sensitive. And I was trying to find theories which would explain this behavior. For example, prospect theory fails so because of the monotonicity of the probability weighting function. And then also studied some other theories, but I couldn't find a good way of making sense of this evidence until I came across salience theory. So this is a rather new theory by Bordalo, Gennaioli, and Shleifer. And I found that modifying this, which I'm going to show you in a second, would at least explain part of the results. So instead of, or contrasted to prospect theory, which overweights small probabilities and underweights almost certain events, the salience theory, they distort probabilities of states in a different way. They do this according to the salience of a state, and this is defined by the difference of payoffs. So we're always in the context of lotteries. And to make clear what I would like to get across here is, let's take the example of the well-known Allet paradox, where we have a risky lottery, L1, which in this example with those numbers pays €2,500 in 33% of the cases, nothing with 1%, and 2,400 with a remaining probability of 66%. And this is less preferred than the safe lottery, which always pays 2,400. So here you see also the common consequence. In both cases, 66% with 2,400, but then this is risk-free. And prospect theory explains this, that subjects usually, of course, overweight the small probability, but salience theory instead says, okay, the state that the risky lottery pays nothing and the safe lottery pays 2,400 is the most salient. There's the highest payoff difference. While the state where both pay 2,400 is not very apparent. Once we replace the common consequence for a zero payoff, salience theory says, okay, now the state where the risky lottery, pays 2,500 and the safe lottery pays nothing, becomes now the most salient, and this is why preferences are reversed. And the way they distort the probabilities is that they assign a salience rank to each state, starting from the most salient one. And the most salient state is assigned 1, and then it goes on. And then basically 2 states, S tilde and S, the ratio of those states is then multiplied by a salience factor, delta, ranging between 0 and 1, to the power of the salience difference, of the salience rank difference. And we can see that once the delta parameter is taking on a value of 1, there's no distortion. So this is the objective probabilities, they remain, and this can be referred to the rational decision maker. But once the delta parameter is approaching 0, more salient states become more weight, and less salient states are becoming less weight. But the thing is, if the delta parameter is kept constant, we cannot explain any violation of dominance. They are able to explain many preference reversals. Usually they find a 0.7 estimator for delta. But however, by keeping this constant, they cannot explain the current issue. So I thought, okay, I should vary the delta parameter on the short subscription. Essentially, the short subscription makes an rational evaluation more salient or less salient. So in the case of DB, which is the short subscription, if this is 1 day or single use, then the rational evaluation becomes very apparent. But once it increases up to 1 week, let's say, then the delta parameter is shrinking and leaves more space for probability distorting. And the C parameter is allowing some heterogeneity between agents, but for the moment, just have this basic concept in mind. And let's turn back to this example. And maybe we can now explain why we see this pigeonholing preference reversal in one case, but not in the other. So to remind you, with prices which are fairly close to each other, 3 and 5 euro, we can see the preference reversal, or we can see some shift of preferences. Always remember that this is only pilot data, so I don't want to oversell this. And I'm really curious about your feedback also. But just for the moment, we see that with little price differences, we have this shift of preferences, but for the larger price difference, we cannot observe this. I would like to convince you that there are also 3 states happening in this context. One is where, regardless of which subscription you took out, if the next time you use the service, so the next time you turn to this platform, will be within 1 week, then you are covered by either of the two subscriptions. And for this case, we can just compare the costs. This is why there's the minus sign of 3 to 4.99. This is state 1. And the same payoffs are happening if the next time we use the service will be after week 10, because then both subscription also expired. And the third state, this is the interesting state, is when the subsequent use happens after week 1. So I would not be covered anymore by the short subscription, but still by the long subscription. So this leaves some room for regret if we talk in terms of the short subscription, or take this as the benchmark, as the reference point, so to say. And depending on the salience function, this is the most salient one, this regret state, for small price differences. But for larger price differences, this regret state is the least salient one. And depending on the presentation of this short subscription, I can or delete the salience between states. For example, if I would assume that 1 day or single use is the rational case, but once I increase the short subscription, maybe this, or at least this is what the modification of the salience theory would argue, then this regret state becomes more salient and may attract a certain agent to commit this preference reversal. So regret states, they gain in salience if this relationship holds, and they lose for the opposite. It's in this, I was just using the rule that if you take out the short subscription in the first place, and then you find out that you have to use the service again, then you will take out the long subscription in the second place. This is based on feedback which I got from participants, but I can also simulate the case where you would still take out the short subscription, and then there would be a slightly different relation, but it would not change the intuition or the idea behind it. Okay, I think I'm already arriving with a conclusion. Let me see how much time is left here, because otherwise I can also show you some more evidence. Are there any questions for the moment? No questions?
So, Frieder, I don't know if this is a question that's appropriate at the moment,
yeah.
Or if it's more of a comment or a suggestion for future research direction. But all of the goods you've been talking about so far are goods that the consumer has no real willpower problems over. But I think a lot of subscription traps happen precisely in sort of these weird, willpower situations where consumers might think, I want to reduce my consumption of this good, but I could sort of purchase a lot of it for a lower price, or I could sort of, take on a small amount of it for sort of high marginal price. I'm thinking in particular of a lot of these supermarket till goods. I remember once I was at a supermarket and they had a single pack of a biscuit for sale for like 80p, which is just ridiculous, right? Because you could buy a whole pack of biscuits for
slightly more
£1, right? But I was like, oh, well, if I just get this one biscuit, I won't be tempted to eat the whole pack. So I was like, oh, I'll buy this like ridiculously overpriced biscuit. And I think if you try and incorporate consumers who are trying to defeat potential willpower problems and firms trying to respond to that, I think you might get some additional really interesting predictions.
I agree, definitely. But the point I want to make here is more that depending on this, on how a subscription is presented, I think it targets different ideas of evaluating a certain good.
Right,
and
right.
It goes a little bit in the realm of framing, depending how you frame a certain, but framing essentially is about keeping a good constant. But here I even decrease the utility, the rational utility of a good, but making it more attractive. And yeah, this leads me to concluding real quick. Then afterwards, I can show you some more data. So as we just discussed, people, they follow rational principles only if a problem is transparent. But once the problem is disguised, people may behave differently, irrational. And I found an example where just the presentation of a single use is targeting the rational evaluation. But once this is absent, then people seem to compare on different criteria. And what I labeled so far the pigeonholing. At the moment, I'm trying to generalize the salience theory in order to see if this can explain some underlying drivers which are responsible for this preference reversal. And definitely, as Stephen said, there are other subscription traps in place which are heavily used by marketers. And this, knowing about this, I found different examples which are already in place, of course. So marketers could use this actively, designing a subscription trap, but also once policymakers know about this bias, steer and, for example, enforcing the single-use option always, or you can also make use of this effect if you think about basic state insurances. It is desired from a perspective to have citizens insured of a longer term. I'd like to test